The wheat fields stretched golden under the merciless July sun when Maria Volkov saw her. It was noon in the summer of 1873 in the village of Kolomna near Moscow. The church bells had just finished ringing 12 times across the scorching Russian countryside. Every other peasant had already retreated to the shade for their midday rest. But Maria stayed in the field because her family needed every grain they could harvest. That's when she appeared in the shimmering heat like a mirage made of white cloth and burning air. The figure moved through the wheat without bending a single stalk. Her dress was whiter than fresh snow, yet somehow untouched by dust or sweat. Maria's grandmother had warned her about this, about the lady who walks at noon. But warnings mean nothing when your children need bread and the harvest waits for no one. 3 hours later, they found Maria collapsed between the wheat rows, with her neck twisted at an impossible angle. The priest said it must have been sunstroke, but the old women knew better. They whispered the name that the priest forbade them to speak in church. Poludnitsa had claimed another victim, who dared to work through the sacred noon hour. Most people in the West know Baba Yaga with her iron teeth and chicken-legged hut. She's become the face of Slavic witchcraft in movies and books and video games. But Baba Yaga was never alone in the dark forests and wheat fields of Eastern Europe. 3 other powerful female entities haunted the Slavic world for over 1,000 years. Mokosh, the ancient goddess who became a witch when Christianity arrived. Kikimora, the household spirit who could bless or curse your home. And Poludnitsa, the deadly Lady Midday, who killed workers in the scorching noon sun. These weren't just random monsters from peasant superstition. They were the spiritual sisters of Baba Yaga, each one representing a different aspect of female power that the Christian church couldn't fully suppress. Their stories survived in whispers and warnings passed from grandmother to granddaughter for generations. Even today, in remote villages from Poland to Russia, old women still leave bread for Mokosh on Friday nights. If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. In the winter of 1892, the women of Vologda village gathered at dawn while Father Constantine slept. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness like shadows carrying small bundles wrapped in rough cloth. Anna Petrova led them to the ancient stone that stood in the birch grove behind the church. The stone was older than anyone could remember, older than the church itself. Each woman placed her bundle at the base of the weathered rock and whispered words that would have horrified their priest. They weren't praying to the Virgin Mary or any saint from the golden icons. They were speaking to Mokosh, the goddess their great-grandmothers had served before Prince Vladimir brought Christianity to Rus in 988. Inside the bundles were offerings that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. Strands of flax from their spinning wheels tied with red thread. Small pieces of bread baked specially on Thursday night for Friday's offering. Drops of sheep's milk mixed with well water drawn before sunrise. These were the gifts for Mokosh, who controlled the moisture in the earth and the fate of their harvest. Father Constantine discovered them just as the sun broke through the birch trees. His face turned the color of beet soup as he recognized what he was seeing. These weren't just his parishioners. These were the wives of the village elders, women who sat in the front pews every Sunday and crossed themselves whenever they passed the church. What blasphemy is this that I witness with my own eyes? The priest's voice shook with rage as he scattered their offerings with his walking stick. But Anna Petrova stood her ground even as the other women cowered. She was 73 years old and had buried 5 children and 2 husbands. You can punish us, Father, but you cannot stop the old ways from living in our hearts. She pointed to the scattered offerings on the frozen ground. Your Christ may rule in heaven, but Mokosh still makes the flax grow and the rain fall. The priest raised his hand to strike her, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the absolute certainty that burned there, or perhaps it was fear. That Sunday, Father Constantine delivered a sermon about pagan superstitions that lasted 2 hours. He threatened excommunication for anyone caught making offerings to false gods. But that Friday night, Anna Petrova returned to the stone alone and left twice as many offerings. Within a week, 3 other women joined her in the darkness. Within a month, there were 12. The priest never caught them again, but he knew they continued their rituals. Every Friday, he would find small signs. A red thread caught on a branch near the stone, drops of milk frozen in the snow, the smell of fresh bread where no bread should be. The women of Vologda had been leaving offerings at that stone for 900 years. They weren't going to stop because one angry priest told them to. Mokosh was far more than just another village superstition or local spirit. She was the only female deity that Prince Vladimir of Kiev included in his pantheon of 6 gods in 980. While Perun, the thunder god, stood at the center, Mokosh held her own place of honor. The chronicles describe her idol standing on the hill above the Dnieper River alongside the male gods. Her name itself tells us something profound about how the ancient Slavs viewed the feminine divine. The root mok means moist or wet in Old Slavonic, connecting her directly to the earth's fertility. Without moisture, the grain wouldn't grow and the flax wouldn't spin properly. She was quite literally the difference between survival and starvation for agricultural communities. In the village of Pskov in 1867, an ethnographer named Pavel Yakushkin recorded something remarkable. The local women told him that Mokosh visited them at night during Lent to check their spinning. If she found that a woman had been lazy, she would tangle the thread so badly it couldn't be fixed. But if the spinning was good and the house was clean, Mokosh would spin a little herself to help. One woman named Darya Mikhailova swore she had seen Mokosh with her own eyes. It happened on a Friday night when Darya had forgotten the prohibition against spinning. She was working by candlelight when she heard the door creak open, though she had barred it. A tall woman entered wearing a white sarafan embroidered with red thread. Her hair was unbound and reached to the floor like a waterfall of gold. The stranger sat at Darya's spinning wheel without speaking a single word. She spun thread so fine it looked like spider silk glistening in the candlelight. But when Darya looked closer, she saw that the woman's fingers were wrong. They were too long and bent in places where no human finger should bend. That's when Darya realized who sat at her wheel and fell to her knees. Forgive me, Mother Mokosh, for breaking the Friday prohibition against spinning." The words tumbled out of Darya's mouth as tears ran down her face. The strange woman stopped spinning and turned to look at her. Her eyes were the color of deep well water, dark and endless and older than time. Then she smiled, and the room filled with the smell of fresh bread and spring rain. When Darya dared to look up again, the woman was gone. But the thread she had spun remained on the wheel, enough to make the finest shirt Darya had ever woven. She sold it at the market for enough money to feed her family through the rest of winter. But she never spun on Friday again for as long as she lived. The Christian church tried desperately to erase Mokosh from the people's memory. They replaced her with Saint Paraskeva, who they called Holy Friday. The saint's icons even looked suspiciously like the old descriptions of Mokosh, a woman with long, unbound hair holding a spindle. But changing the name didn't change the practices that went back 1,000 years. In Ukraine, the connection was even more obvious and impossible to hide. Women there called her Mokosh Paraskeva, as if the goddess and saint were the same person. They left offerings of vegetables and flax at crossroads on Fridays, just as their ancestors had done. When the priests weren't watching, they would pour water on the ground and say, "This is for you, Mokosh Mother." The Friday prohibitions that Mokosh enforced were taken deadly seriously across the Slavic world. No spinning or weaving or washing clothes on her sacred day. Women who broke these rules faced punishments that went far beyond tangled thread. In the Novgorod region, they told of a woman named Irina who insisted on washing her clothes on Good Friday. That night, Irina woke to find her arms covered in painful boils that looked like spindle wounds. The wise woman of the village told her to take bread and salt to the crossroads at midnight. She must leave them there with an apology to Mokosh, spoken 3 times. Irina did as instructed, and the boils disappeared by morning, but left scars. Every Friday for the rest of her life, those scars would ache to remind her. The ethnographer Natalia Vinogradova collected over 200 stories about Mokosh in the 1890s. From western Poland to the Ural Mountains, the pattern was always the same. A female deity connected to moisture and spinning who punished laziness and rewarded hard work. A goddess who had been renamed but never truly converted to Christianity. What makes Mokosh particularly fascinating is how she adapted to survive in a Christian world. She didn't disappear or transform into a demon like many pagan deities. Instead, she went underground literally and figuratively into the world of women's work. The church could control what happened in public on Sunday morning, but they couldn't control what women whispered over their spinning wheels on Friday night. In Belarus, the connection between Mokosh and women's economic power was especially clear. The flax and wool that women spun was often their only source of independent income. A woman who pleased Mokosh would have thread that never broke and cloth that sold for the highest prices. This wasn't just about superstition. It was about survival in a world where women had few rights. The village of Minsk had a story that everyone knew, but only women would tell. There was a merchant's wife named Katerina, whose husband beat her and took her earnings. One Friday night, she left her finest thread at the old oak tree with a plea to Mokosh. The next morning, her husband's hands became twisted with arthritis so severe he couldn't hold anything. He never hit Katerina again, and she became the primary breadwinner of the family. Whether Mokosh actually cursed the merchant, or whether the women of Minsk took matters into their own hands, the message was clear. The goddess protected those who honored her and punished those who harmed her daughters. This gave women a source of power that existed completely outside the patriarchal structures of both church and state. By the early 20th century, the Soviet government tried to stamp out all religious practices, including the cult of Mokosh. But collectivization of agriculture had an unexpected effect. When women worked together in the fields and textile factories, they shared the old stories more than ever. The Communist Party meetings couldn't stop grandmothers from teaching their granddaughters the Friday prohibitions. In 1973, the Soviet ethnographer Elena Levkievskaya interviewed elderly women in rural Russia about their beliefs. She was shocked to find that Mokosh was still very much alive in their worldview. One 90-year-old woman named Agrafena from Kostroma told her something remarkable. The communists think they destroyed the old gods, but Mokosh simply changed her clothes again. Agrafena laughed, showing her 3 remaining teeth. First, she wore the robes of a goddess, then the dress of a saint, and now the uniform of a textile worker. She pointed to the collective farm's textile factory, visible through the window. But she's still there, making sure the thread doesn't break and the cloth is strong. Today, in the 21st century, Mokosh has experienced an unexpected revival. Modern Slavic pagans have reclaimed her as a symbol of feminine power and ecological awareness. But more surprisingly, elderly women in villages from Poland to Russia still maintain the Friday prohibitions. They may not call it worship, but they still don't wash clothes on Friday. They still leave bread at crossroads, though now they say it's for the birds. The goddess who survived Christianity and communism isn't giving up easily. The Volkonsky family moved into the old wooden house in Yaroslavl on a cold October day in 1884. The previous owners had left suddenly without explanation, selling the property for half its value. Mikhail Volkonsky thought he had gotten the bargain of his lifetime. His wife Elena wasn't so sure, especially after the neighbors crossed themselves when they heard the address. The first night passed peacefully enough, though Elena could have sworn she heard spinning in the attic. The second night, their youngest daughter Masha woke screaming about a little old woman sitting on her chest. The third night, all their dishes fell from the shelves at exactly 3 in the morning. By the fourth night, even skeptical Mikhail admitted something was terribly wrong. Elena's mother arrived from the countryside on the 5th day and immediately knew what they were dealing with. You have a Kikimora, and from the sound of it, she's not happy about new tenants. The old woman walked through each room, sniffing the air like a hunting dog. In the cellar, she found what she was looking for, a small doll made of straw hidden behind a loose brick. Someone cursed this house by inviting a Kikimora to live here. She held up the doll, which was wrapped in a piece of cloth that looked suspiciously like a child's dress. This was probably made by the previous family when they lost a baby. Elena gasped because the neighbors had mentioned the former owners lost an infant daughter. Sometimes, bereaved parents invited a Kikimora, hoping the spirit of their child would return. But Kikimoras were never truly the spirits of dead children, though they might pretend to be. They were something older and stranger, female house spirits that existed parallel to the male domovoi. Where the domovoi protected the house and its inhabitants, the Kikimora's relationship with humans was far more complicated. She could be a blessing or a curse depending on how she was treated. Elena's mother knew exactly what to do because she had dealt with 3 Kikimoras in her lifetime. First, they had to acknowledge the spirit's presence with respect, not fear. That night, she placed a small dish of bread and salt in the cellar where she found the doll. Then she spoke to the empty air, as if addressing an honored but difficult relative. Kikimora of this house, we acknowledge you and respect your prior claim to this dwelling. The old woman's voice was firm but polite, like negotiating with a stubborn merchant. The Volkonsky family means no disrespect and asks only to share this space in peace. She then laid out specific terms: no spinning at night, no sitting on children, no breaking dishes. In exchange, they would leave weekly offerings and keep the house spotlessly clean. That night, the spinning sound was louder than ever, but nothing broke, and Masha slept peacefully. The next morning, Elena found all her tangled thread had been spun into perfect skeins. The Kikimora had accepted the bargain, but she would test them constantly. Any laziness in housework would be punished with mysterious stains and broken items. But exceptional cleanliness would be rewarded with small helps: mending done overnight, or bread that rose perfectly. The Volkonsky family learned to live with their invisible housemate for 7 years. Elena would sometimes glimpse a small figure in the corner of her eye, no bigger than a child, but dressed like an old woman. Once she saw tiny, wet footprints leading from the cellar to the kitchen. Another time, she found her daughter's lost doll carefully repaired and returned to her bed. But in 1891, Mikhail decided to renovate the cellar without warning the Kikimora. The workers broke through the wall where the spirit lived and found a cache of strange objects. Buttons from clothes the family had never owned, locks of hair wrapped in red thread, 73 copper kopecks, all dated before 1800. They threw it all away, thinking it was garbage from previous owners. That night, the Kikimora's fury was beyond anything they had experienced. Every piece of furniture in the house was overturned. The windows rattled so hard 3 of them cracked. A terrible wailing came from the walls like a woman in unbearable grief. Worst of all, Mikhail woke to find something sitting on his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He couldn't see her clearly, but he felt ancient fingers around his throat. Small and cold and impossibly strong for something that weighed no more than a cat. You destroyed my home and scattered my treasures. The voice was like wind through broken glass. Now I will destroy yours piece by piece until nothing remains. Elena's mother returned immediately, but this time she looked genuinely frightened. A Kikimora whose home had been destroyed was no longer bound by any bargains. She would torment the family until they fled or died from exhaustion. The only solution was to find a new home for the spirit or convince her to leave. Neither option was likely to succeed once a Kikimora turned truly malevolent. They tried everything the old woman knew from her mother and grandmother. They rebuilt the cellar wall exactly as it had been. They gathered similar objects to replace what was thrown away. They left elaborate offerings of bread and milk and honey. They even had a priest come to bless the house, though he didn't know the real reason. Nothing worked, and the nightly torments continued getting worse. Finally, Elena remembered something the neighbor had said about the previous family. Their infant daughter had been named Anfisa and was buried in the local cemetery. On a desperate hunch, Elena visited the tiny grave that had no marker, just a wooden cross. She left flowers and spoke to the spirit of the child, asking her to call off the Kikimora. That night, the house was silent for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Elena found a small pile of her missing buttons on the kitchen table. The Kikimora hadn't forgiven them, but she had pulled back her assault. The family sold the house within a month and moved to Moscow. The next owners lasted 3 days before fleeing, and the house stood empty for 20 years. The Kikimora represents something profound about how Slavic people understood domestic space. Every house was alive with spirits that had their own needs and personalities. The domovoi might be the official guardian, but the Kikimora was the enforcer of standards. She particularly despised lazy housewives and would punish them creatively. In Poland, they called her Kikimora or Mora, and she had a special relationship with spinning. Women who left their spinning wheels untidy would wake to find all their thread tangled beyond repair. But those who kept their tools clean might find extra thread spun overnight. The sound of invisible spinning was the most common sign of a Kikimora's presence. That rhythmic whir and click in the darkness that made brave men pull blankets over their heads. The ethnographer Dmitry Zelenin collected dozens of Kikimora stories in the early 1900s. He noticed distinct regional variations in how people described and dealt with these spirits. In northern Russia, the Kikimora was usually invisible or appeared as a tiny old woman. In the south, she might manifest as a young girl with long black hair. In Belarus, she could shapeshift into a cat or a chicken or even a piece of straw. But certain elements remained constant across all Slavic territories. The Kikimora was always female and always connected to domestic work. She lived in liminal spaces, cellars and attics, and the space behind the stove. She was most active at night, especially between midnight and dawn. And she had an obsessive relationship with cleanliness and order. The village of Vologda had a particularly detailed tradition about Kikimora's origins. They believed she could enter a house in 3 ways, each more disturbing than the last. The first was through a curse, usually placed by someone who helped build the house. Carpenters who weren't paid properly might hide a Kikimora doll in the walls. The spirit would then torment the owners until they made things right with the builder. The second way was through tragedy, particularly the death of an unbaptized child. The soul of the infant couldn't enter heaven, but didn't want to leave its home. A Kikimora would sometimes possess that lingering essence and pretend to be the child. This type was the most unpredictable, sometimes protective, and sometimes viciously cruel. The third and most frightening way was when a Kikimora simply chose a house she liked. no curse or tragedy needed. She just decided to move in like a squatter from another realm. These Kikimoras were ancient spirits that had existed since before humans built houses. They were nearly impossible to remove because the house was never really yours to begin with. A merchant named Ivan Petrov left a detailed account of his family's Kikimora encounter in 1876. They had just built a new house in Nizhny Novgorod with all the modern conveniences. The first sign of trouble was his wife's sewing needles going missing every night. They would search everywhere, only to find them the next morning, stuck in the ceiling beams. Then the Kikimora started leaving messages by arranging objects in meaningful patterns. Spoons laid out to spell words, buttons forming the shape of a coffin, thread woven into symbols no one could read. Ivan's wife, Marina, became convinced the spirit was trying to warn them about something. She spent hours trying to decode the messages until she started talking to empty rooms. The situation escalated when Marina began leaving elaborate offerings for the Kikimora. Not just bread and salt, but jewelry and coins and even locks of her children's hair. She claimed the Kikimora was teaching her things, showing her the future in puddles of spilled milk. Ivan tried to intervene, but Marina insisted the spirit was their protector, not their enemy. Everything changed when their youngest son, Pyotr, fell seriously ill with scarlet fever. Marina begged the Kikimora to save him, offering everything she owned. That night, the house shook like an earthquake, and a woman's laughter echoed from the walls. In the morning, Pyotr's fever had broken, but Marina's hair had turned completely white. She never spoke about what happened that night, but she also never left offerings again. The Soviet era brought unexpected changes to Kikimora beliefs and practices. Collective farms meant communal living where multiple families shared large houses. Suddenly, people who had never dealt with house spirits were forced to negotiate shared space with Kikimoras. The results were often chaotic, with spirits confused by multiple families with different standards. In 1954, a collective farm in Ukraine reported what they called anomalous household disruptions. Every family in the communal house experienced different problems simultaneously. One family's dishes broke, while another's clothes were found shredded. A third family found their furniture rearranged every morning. The local party secretary tried to blame saboteurs, but everyone knew it was a Kikimora. An elderly woman named Oksana finally took charge of the situation. She organized all the families to clean the house together on the same day. Then she had each family leave a small offering in a different corner. She explained that the Kikimora was confused by so many people and needed clear boundaries. Within a week, the disturbances stopped and the house became suspiciously well maintained. The Kikimora's relationship with modernity proved surprisingly adaptable. As houses got electricity and running water, the spirits learned to manipulate new technologies. Light bulbs would flicker in meaningful patterns. Radios would turn on at specific times. Washing machines would run by themselves at midnight. The Kikimora evolved with the times, but her essential nature remained unchanged. A factory worker named Svetlana recorded her experiences in 1982 in Leningrad. Her apartment in a new concrete building seemed immune to old superstitions. But then she started finding her sewing machine had been used during the night. Perfect stitches in fabric she hadn't touched, thread used that she hadn't bought. Sometimes she would find tiny clothes no bigger than her thumb sewn with impossible precision. Svetlana's grandmother visited and immediately recognized the signs. Kikimoras don't care if the house is wood or concrete, old or new. She instructed Svetlana to leave a thimble of milk by the sewing machine each night. The invisible sewing continued, but now Svetlana would find small gifts in return. Missing buttons returned, torn clothes mended, and once a tiny embroidered flower so detailed it looked alive. The relationship between Kikimoras and domovoi was complex and often misunderstood. While the domovoi was considered the male head of household spirits, the Kikimora was not his wife. She was his counterpart, but operated independently with her own agenda. Sometimes they worked together, but often they were at odds. A story from Belarus illustrated this tension perfectly. A family had both a helpful domovoi and a mischievous Kikimora. The domovoi would fix things at night, while the Kikimora would break them. The husband left offerings for the domovoi, while the wife appeased the Kikimora. This went on for years until the family realized the spirits were teaching them about balance. Too much order was as bad as too much chaos. Both forces were necessary. Today, the Kikimora has found new life in unexpected places. Urban legends speak of Kikimoras in office buildings where computers malfunction and papers disappear. Apartment dwellers blame Kikimoras for neighbors' noise and missing packages. Some modern witches claim to work with Kikimoras for household protection. The ancient spirit has adapted to glass towers and smart homes. But in the rural villages where electricity is still unreliable, the old ways persist. Grandmothers still teach their granddaughters to leave bread for the house spirits. They still warn against leaving spinning wheels or sewing machines uncovered at night. They still know that a house is never truly empty. Something always watches from the shadows. The Kikimora waits patiently for recognition, for respect, for the offerings that bind the human and spirit worlds together. The wheat field outside the Czech village of Třebíč shimmered like golden water on July 15, 1888. Jan Dvořák could see the other harvesters had already retreated to the shade when the church bells struck 12. But his family needed every bushel of grain to pay their debts to the landlord. His wife Marie had begged him not to work through the noon hour. "Remember what happened to the Novak boy last summer," she had whispered. But Jan was strong and young and didn't believe in old women's tales. The first sign was how the air seemed to thicken around him like invisible honey. His scythe became heavier with each swing, though he had been working since dawn without trouble. Then the wheat itself began to look wrong. The stalks seemed to grow taller and lean away from him. That's when he saw her floating above the grain like morning mist, given human form. She wore white, but it wasn't cloth. It was noon, sunlight woven into the shape of a dress. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat and moved without wind like underwater plants. In her hand she carried a scythe that gleamed brighter than polished silver. Jan tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. They felt like melting wax in the brutal heat. Why do you work when the sun commands rest? Her voice was the sound of grain rustling but somehow formed words. Answer my questions correctly, and I might let you leave with only madness. She began to ask him about the grain. How many seeds in a single head of wheat? How many days from planting to harvest in a dry year versus wet? What prayers should be said when the first shoots appear? Jan was a good farmer, but her questions went beyond normal knowledge. She asked about varieties of wheat that had gone extinct before his grandfather was born. She demanded he recite cultivation methods from the time of the old Slavic gods. When he couldn't answer, she moved closer, and the heat became unbearable. His vision blurred, and his tongue swelled in his mouth like a dry sponge. They found him at sunset, sprawled between the wheat rows with his neck twisted backward. His eyes were open, but showed only white like boiled eggs. His skin was burned red despite wearing his shirt and hat all day. The doctor from town said it was clearly sunstroke and dehydration. But the old women knew better because they had seen this before. His wife Marie found something the doctor missed: perfect sickle marks on his ankles. Not cuts, but burns in the exact shape of a curved blade. The marks never healed properly and would bleed every summer at noon. Jan survived, but was never quite right in his mind afterward. He would start screaming whenever the church bells rang 12. Sometimes he would whisper answers to questions nobody had asked, always about wheat and harvest and forgotten agricultural secrets. The Czech knew her as Poludnitsa, while the Poles called her Poludnitsa. In Serbia, she was Podne, or sometimes Sipolnitsa. The Russians named her Poludnitsa, which meant exactly what she was, the demon of midday. But regardless of the name, she was the same entity, the lady who enforced the sacred noon rest. Every Slavic culture had stories about her, and they all agreed on the essential details. She appeared only at noon during the hottest part of summer. She targeted those who worked in the fields when they should be resting. Her weapons were sunstroke and madness, and that terrible curved blade. But most of all, she was a guardian of ancient agricultural knowledge. In the Polish village of Zakopane, they had a different version of her test. Instead of questions about grain, she would demand the worker tell her stories. But not just any stories they had, to last exactly 1 hour until the danger passed. If you repeated yourself or stopped talking even for a breath, she would strike. The challenge was that the heat made thinking almost impossible. Stanisław Kowalski learned this in 1872 when he encountered Poludnitsa. He was cutting hay in the mountain meadows above the village. The noon bells echoed across the valley, but he had only a small section left. That's when she appeared walking through the hay without disturbing a single blade. She was beautiful in a terrible way, like staring directly at the sun. Her white dress seemed to glow from within and hurt to look at. "Tell me a story, shepherd boy, and make it last until the bells ring one." Stanisław knew the legends and began talking immediately. He told her about the founding of Zakopane and the furs, and settlers in the mountains. He described every building in the village and who lived in each house. He recited the names of every sheep in his flock and their lineages. When he ran out of real stories, he began making them up. Tales of talking wolves and magical springs and trees that grew backwards. His mouth became so dry his lips cracked and bled. Sweat poured down his face, but he didn't dare wipe it away. The lady stood perfectly still, just watching him with eyes like noon sky. Finally, after what felt like days, the church bells rang 1 o'clock. She smiled, showing teeth that looked like wheat kernels, and vanished. Stanisław collapsed and lay in the meadow until evening. When he tried to tell others what happened, his voice was gone. It took 3 days before he could speak above a whisper. For the rest of his life, he never worked past 11 in the morning. He also became the village's greatest storyteller, though he never explained why. The Serbian version of Podne was particularly vicious compared to her northern sisters. In the village of Kruševac, she didn't just kill those who worked at noon. She would hunt anyone who was outdoors during the sacred hour. Children walking home from school, women fetching water, even priests visiting the sick. An account from 1895 described her attack on a wedding party. They were traveling between villages and couldn't reach shelter before noon. The White Lady appeared on the road ahead of them like a heat mirage. She asked the groom 3 riddles about the nature of marriage. When he answered incorrectly, she touched his forehead with 1 finger. He fell from his horse and began convulsing in the dust. His skin turned bright red as if boiled from within. The bride tried to help him, but Podne grabbed her wrist. "You cannot save him, but you can join him if you wish." The bride's mother pulled her away and the party fled. The groom survived but remained bedridden for 3 months. When he recovered, he had no memory of his bride or the wedding. The marriage was annulled and the bride entered a convent. The locals said Podne had stolen the love from his heart as punishment. Some claimed this was merciful. She usually took lives, not just memories. What made Poludnitsa particularly terrifying was her unpredictability. Sometimes she would simply cause dizzy spells or mild confusion. Other times, she would drive people completely insane. And occasionally, she would kill without warning or reason. You never knew which version you would encounter. The Russian ethnographer Vladimir Dahl collected dozens of Poludnitsa encounters in the 1860s. He noticed that she appeared most often during harvest time, when the temptation to work through noon was strongest. But she wasn't limited to grain fields. She haunted any agricultural space. Vegetable gardens, orchards, hay meadows, even flower fields. In the Voronezh region, she had a peculiar obsession with children. Not to harm them, but to lead them astray during noon. Parents would find their children miles from home with no memory of walking there. The children would say a beautiful lady in white had shown them wonderful things. Fields of flowers that didn't exist, streams that ran uphill, trees that grew candy. One mother, named Daria Petrova, described finding her son in 1883. 6-year-old Mikhail had disappeared at exactly noon while playing near the house. They searched for hours and found him at sunset in a field 10 miles away. He was sitting in a circle of wheat that had been twisted into complex patterns. The boy claimed the white lady had been teaching him important secrets. He drew strange symbols in the dirt that looked almost like writing. He sang songs in a language no one recognized. For weeks afterward, he would stop whatever he was doing at noon and stare at the sun. His mother had to lock him indoors every midday until the behavior stopped. The Ukrainian version, called Lady Midday, was notable for her connection to pregnancy and birth. Pregnant women were absolutely forbidden from being outdoors at noon. The belief was that Poludnitsa could curse the unborn child. Or worse, she could steal the baby's soul before it was even born. In the village of Poltava in 1891, a pregnant woman named Oksana ignored the warnings. She needed to fetch water and thought she could make it back before noon. But the church bells caught her at the well with no shelter nearby. She saw Poludnitsa's reflection in the water, a face made of rippling sunlight. "Your child will be born with the noon mark," the reflection said. Oksana ran home, but the damage was done. When her daughter was born, she had a birthmark shaped like the sun on her forehead. More disturbing, the child would fall into trances every day at noon. Her eyes would roll back, and she would speak prophecies about the weather. The villagers were terrified, but also found the girl useful. Her noon prophecies were always accurate about coming storms or droughts. She grew up to become a respected weather prophet. But she never married because everyone feared she belonged to Poludnitsa. She lived alone at the edge of the village and died at exactly noon on her 60th birthday. The Western Slavs had developed elaborate protection rituals against Lady Midday. In Bohemia, field workers would carry special noon breads blessed by wise women. If Poludnitsa appeared, they would throw the bread at her and run. The spirit would be compelled to count every crumb before pursuing. This gave the worker time to reach shelter or at least shade. In Slovakia, they used a different method involving sacred knots. Workers would tie complex knots in pieces of rope during safe morning hours. If Lady Midday appeared, they would throw the rope at her feet. She would have to untie every knot before she could attack. The most complex knots could keep her busy until the danger passed. But the most effective protection was simply respecting the noon prohibition. Every Slavic culture had some version of mandatory midday rest during summer. This wasn't just superstition. It was practical wisdom about avoiding heat stroke. Poludnitsa was the personification of the sun's killing power at its peak. She enforced a natural law that protected people from their own stubbornness. The German settlers who moved into Slavic lands often ignored these warnings. They saw the noon rest as primitive superstition and laziness. But after enough German farmers died of sunstroke, they began to listen. By the late 1800s, even German agricultural manuals recommended avoiding noon work. They didn't mention Poludnitsa, but they adopted her schedule. The Soviet collectivization period created new challenges for Poludnitsa beliefs. The Communist Party demanded maximum agricultural productivity. Rest periods were seen as counter-revolutionary sabotage. But farm workers still remembered what happened to those who defied Lady Midday. In 1932, a collective farm in Belarus reported 11 deaths from heat exposure. all had occurred at exactly noon during the July harvest. The official report blamed poor hydration and overwork, but the survivors all described seeing a white figure in the fields. The farm director himself claimed she had asked him about Stalin's agricultural policies. When he gave the party-approved answers, she laughed and disappeared. After that incident, the farm instituted a mandatory break from 11:30 to 1. They called it a scientific heat management period. Production actually increased because fewer workers collapsed. Other collective farms quietly adopted similar policies. The party officials pretended not to notice the correlation. Modern agricultural mechanization has largely eliminated Poludnitsa encounters. Air-conditioned tractor cabs protect farmers from the noon sun. Migrant workers have no cultural context for the prohibition. But in remote villages, where hand harvesting continues, the warnings persist. In 2018, a Ukrainian farmer named Petro told an anthropologist his story. He had been cutting wheat with a scythe because his combine had broken. At noon, he saw a woman in white standing at the field's edge. She looked like a heat mirage, but her eyes were perfectly clear. He immediately dropped his scythe and walked away without looking back. My grandfather saw her in 1954 and survived by running. I'm not brave enough to test whether she's real or not. 3 women in 3 different places faced their supernatural sisters on the same Friday in July 1893. In Russia, Anna Sergeyeva knelt at the old stone behind the church at midnight. She whispered prayers to Mokosh, begging for rain for her dying crops. Her husband thought she was at home asleep beside him. The priest would have condemned her as a witch if he knew. But Anna knew that Mokosh had saved her grandmother's harvest in the Great Drought of 1840. Sometimes the old gods were the only ones who listened to desperate women. In Poland, Katarzyna Nowak woke to the sound of spinning in her attic. Her Kikimora was angry because Katarzyna had forgotten to leave the weekly offering. The spirit had already tangled all the thread and hidden the sewing needles. Katarzyna knew by morning her best dress would be ruined unless she made amends. She crept downstairs to prepare bread and salt, hoping it wasn't too late. Her husband slept through it all. Men never heard the Kikimora's warnings. In Czechia, Marie Dvořák was the same woman whose husband Jan had encountered Poludnitsa 5 years earlier. At exactly noon, she stood at the edge of the wheat field where he had nearly died. She could see Lady Midday shimmering in the heat waves like a mirage. Marie didn't run or cower, but stood her ground and spoke clearly. "You took his mind but left his body, and for that I thank you." The white lady tilted her head and for just a moment looked almost human. These 3 women never met and never knew of each other's existence. But they were connected by something deeper than geography or chance. Each was negotiating with female powers that existed outside Christian authority. Each understood that these spirits were neither good nor evil, but simply were. And each knew that men would never fully understand this shadow world of women's magic. The parallels between Mokosh, Kikimora, and Poludnitsa reveal something profound about Slavic cosmology. All 3 are female entities in a religious system dominated by male gods and saints. All three are connected to women's work: spinning, weaving, harvesting, household management. All three enforce rules and boundaries through punishment and reward. And all three survive the conversion to Christianity by going underground. But the differences are equally telling about their specific functions. Mokosh was a goddess demoted to witch, but retaining divine power over fate and fertility. Kikimora was always a household spirit, neither divine nor demonic, but liminal. Poludnitsa was pure nature force, the personified danger of the killing sun. Together they formed a trinity of female power at three different levels of existence. Mokosh operated at the cosmic level, determining the fate of entire communities. Her domain was the moisture that made life possible in agricultural societies. Without her blessing, the crops would fail and villages would starve. She was too powerful for the church to completely destroy. So they renamed her Saint Paraskeva and pretended the worship had ended. But every Friday night, for 1,000 years, women still left her offerings. Kikimora worked at the domestic level, managing individual households. She was intimately involved in daily life, watching, judging, helping, hindering. Her presence made every home a negotiated space between human and spirit worlds. She couldn't be eliminated because she was part of the house itself. Like load-bearing walls or the foundation, remove her and everything collapses. So families learned to live with her demands for cleanliness and respect. Poludnitsa existed at the natural level, enforcing the rhythm of agricultural work. She was the boundary between human ambition and natural limits. Her noon prohibition wasn't arbitrary, but essential for survival. Work too hard in the heat, and you die. It's that simple. She was the sun's enforcer, making sure humans respected its power. No amount of prayer or offering could change her fundamental nature. All three spirits share a peculiar relationship with Christianity that goes beyond simple suppression. The church couldn't eliminate them because they served essential functions. Instead, Christianity had to accommodate them through creative reinterpretation. Mokosh became a saint. Kikimora became a demon. Poludnitsa became a cautionary tale. But underneath the Christian veneer, they remained exactly what they always were. The gendered aspect of these spirits cannot be ignored or minimized. In patriarchal Slavic society, women had limited official power. But through these spirits, they accessed authority outside male control. A woman who knew how to negotiate with Mokosh could ensure good harvest. One who pleased her Kikimora would have a mysteriously efficient household. And everyone, even strong men, feared the woman who understood Poludnitsa's ways. This created a parallel power structure that existed alongside official hierarchies. Men had the church and state and written law. Women had the spirits and folk knowledge and oral tradition. Neither side fully understood the other, but both were necessary. The spirits gave women agency in a world that otherwise denied it. The Soviet ethnographer Natalia Vinogradova noted this pattern in 1978. She interviewed hundreds of women across the Soviet Union about folk beliefs. Even committed Communist Party members admitted to superstitions about house spirits. They would deny believing in Kikimora, but still covered their sewing machines at night. They mocked Mokosh worship, but avoided washing clothes on Friday. They laughed at Poludnitsa stories, but took their lunch break at noon. What Vinogradova realized was that these weren't just superstitions. They were cultural technologies for managing risk and resources. Mokosh's Friday prohibition ensured women had 1 day of reduced labor. Kikimora's cleanliness demands prevented disease in crowded households. Poludnitsa's noon rest protected workers from heat exhaustion. The spirits encoded practical wisdom in memorable supernatural forms. But beyond the practical, there was something deeper at work. These spirits represented the irreducible wildness of the feminine divine. They couldn't be tamed or converted or rationalized away. Like Baba Yaga, their more famous sister, they existed outside civilization's boundaries. They reminded everyone that not everything could be controlled. The comparison with Baba Yaga illuminates this shared wildness. Baba Yaga lived in the forest between life and death. Mokosh lived between earth and sky, determining fate. Kikimora lived between seen and unseen in the shadows of homes. Poludnitsa lived between bearable and unbearable in the killing heat. All four occupied liminal spaces where normal rules didn't apply. But while Baba Yaga became famous in Western fairy tales, the other three remained hidden. This wasn't accidental, but strategic. Baba Yaga could be safely exoticized as a foreign witch. But Mokosh, Kikimora, and Poludnitsa were still actively worshipped. Keeping them secret protected them from outside scrutiny. They remained powerful because they remained hidden. Maria Volkov's story didn't end in that wheat field in 1873. She survived her encounter with Poludnitsa, but was forever changed. Her neck never healed properly, and she couldn't turn her head without pain. But she gained something else, the ability to sense Lady Midday's presence. For the next 40 years, she warned workers when the White Lady was near. She saved 17 lives by her count, though no one kept official records. Before she died in 1913, Maria told her granddaughter something important. The spirits aren't evil, child. They're just older than our understanding. Mokosh remembers when the earth was young and humans were nothing. Kikimora knew houses before we built them, in spaces between spaces. And Poludnitsa, she is the sun's own daughter, teaching us our limits. Baba Yaga gets the glory because she's the one men can understand. But these three sisters hold the real power because they never left. Maria was right in ways she couldn't have imagined. Today, in the 21st century, these three spirits persist in unexpected forms. Mokosh has been reclaimed by Slavic neo-pagans as a goddess of ecology. Kikimora appears in horror movies and urban legends about haunted apartments. Poludnitsa lives on in agricultural safety regulations mandating rest periods. They adapted and survived just as they survived Christianity and communism. The three sisters of Baba Yaga were never sisters by blood, but by function. They represented the fundamental truth that female power cannot be eliminated. It can be renamed, suppressed, demonized, marginalized, but never destroyed, because it's woven into the fabric of existence itself. When we forget these spirits, we lose more than quaint folklore. We lose the wisdom they encoded about limits and boundaries and respect. We lose the understanding that not everything should be conquered or controlled. And we lose the recognition that power comes in many forms. Not just the obvious strength of thunder gods and warrior saints, but also the subtle power of moisture and shadows and noonday sun. The women who still leave bread for Mokosh know something important. The families who respect their Kikimora understand something essential. The farmers who rest at noon remember something vital. These spirits are maps to survival in a dangerous world. They're instruction manuals written in myth and nightmare. And they're reminders that the old ways never really die. They just wait patiently in the shadows for someone to remember their names.